When I first saw the job listing for a graveyard keeper at Whispering Willow Cemetery, I wasn't looking for anything glamorous. In fact, I wasn't looking for anything at all. I'd been let go from my last job 3 months earlier, my savings were running out, and desperation had a way of making me less picky. The listing promised decent pay, flexible hours, and quiet surroundings. It sounded like a dream for someone like me, someone who wanted to disappear for a while. The cemetery was a 20-minute drive from town, nestled at the base of a steep hill where the trees were so thick that even midday felt like dusk. When I arrived, the wrought iron gates loomed tall and menacing, their intricate patterns of vines and thorns somehow sharper than they should have been. I met the caretaker, Mr. Galloway, in the small office near the gates. He looked like he belonged in the cemetery, with his thin frame, sunken eyes, and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. He handed me a folder of rules without much ceremony and said, "If you follow these, you'll be fine. Break them and, well, you'll figure it out." That should have been my first clue to turn around and leave, but I was too focused on keeping a roof over my head. Yeesh. The cemetery itself was unlike anything I'd expected. Rows of old tombstones stretched out endlessly, some so worn by time that the names were little more than smudges on the stone. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves, and no matter where I stood, it always felt colder than it should. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was the kind that pressed against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every little sound you made. The gravekeeper's cabin, where I'd be staying, sat near the edge of the property. It was small, with peeling paint and a roof that looked like it had seen better decades, but it had a bed, a kitchen, and a bathroom, more than enough for someone like me. The rules in the folder were odd. Rule 1. Always carry the lantern with you after sunset. Its flame is the only light the dead respect. Rule 2. If you hear whispers coming from the trees, ignore them. They're not for you. Rule 3. Never let the gates stay open for more than 30 seconds. If something comes in, close the gates and leave. Rule 4. Do not step on freshly disturbed soil. The dead don't like to be disturbed twice. Rule 5. If you hear someone knocking on your cabin door after midnight, do not answer. I laughed nervously as I read through them. They had to be a joke, right? Some kind of hazing ritual for new hires? But when I glanced at Mr. Galloway, his expression didn't match the humor I was searching for. "Don't test them," he said. "Not even once." I nodded. But I was already second-guessing everything. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the cemetery changed. The shadows stretched impossibly long, merging with the surrounding trees until it felt like the darkness itself was alive. The lantern flickered faintly in my hand as I made my first rounds, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, until I heard the whispers. They started faintly, barely audible like the sound of wind brushing through the trees. But as I walked, they grew louder, words forming in a language I couldn't understand. I stopped in my tracks, clutching the lantern tightly. "Rule 2, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Ignore them." And so I did. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, the whispers followed me. The second night felt heavier. Not in the physical sense, but something about the air. It was thicker, like it carried a weight of its own. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion from my first night on the job, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I kept the lantern close as I walked the familiar paths, its glow casting long, uneasy shadows on the weathered headstones. It started small. The whispers weren't confined to the trees anymore. They came from everywhere. The stones, the wind, the ground beneath my feet. It felt as though the cemetery itself was breathing, exhaling in soft, chilling murmurs. I found myself gripping the lantern tighter than I realized, my knuckles whitening under the strain. When I reached the far corner of the cemetery, I noticed something strange. A grave that hadn't been there the night before. The soil was freshly disturbed, its edges sharp and uneven, as if it had been hastily dug. A simple wooden marker sat at its head, but there was no name carved into it. "Rule 4, I muttered, stepping carefully around it. "Do not step on freshly disturbed soil." As I passed, I could have sworn the lantern flickered. Back in the cabin, I tried to shake the unease. The folder of rules sat on the desk where I'd left it, and for some reason, it felt like it was watching me. I flipped through it again, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but the pages were as cryptic as before. There was no mention of why these rules existed, no hint of what would happen if they were broken. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before, a faded note tucked between the pages. "The ground remembers. Keep your footsteps light and your heart lighter." The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. The edges of the paper were torn, as if whoever wrote it had been in a hurry. Who wrote this? And why was it hidden? Later that night, I decided to inspect the office. It felt like the kind of place that held secrets. Mr. Galloway had left in a hurry after my first shift, muttering something about not staying past his time. The office smelled of damp wood and old paper, the scent clinging to the walls like a second skin. The desk was cluttered with yellowed documents and faded photographs. Most of them were boring, maintenance reports, burial records, but one stood out, a grainy black and white photo of a man standing in the middle of the cemetery. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a lantern identical to mine. Scrawled across the back of the photo were 3 words, "And didn't listen." My stomach twisted. I shoved the photo into my pocket and kept digging. Beneath the clutter, I found a journal. The leather cover was cracked and the pages were brittle, but it was still readable. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone named Samuel, apparently a previous gravekeeper. His words were strange, almost disjointed, as if he'd been losing his grip on reality. The whispers grow louder every night. I can feel them pulling at me, trying to drag me closer. The rules are the only thing keeping me alive. I read on, my hands trembling. Something moved near the oak tree today. I thought it was a shadow, but shadows don't breathe. It watched me until I left. I think it knows I saw it. The final entry was even worse. Exercise improves mood by rehabilitating their brains. The knocking won't stop. I can't answer. I won't. But what if... The sentence cut off abruptly, a dark smear of ink trailing down the page. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just an old man's paranoia. This was a warning, and I was walking straight into whatever had taken him. That night, the cemetery felt different. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The paths I'd memorized on my first night seemed to stretch endlessly, curving in ways that didn't make sense. And then I heard it, a soft knock. It wasn't coming from my cabin, it was coming from the gates. My heart lurched as I remembered Rule 3. Never let the gate stay open for more than 30 seconds. I ran, the lantern's flame flickering wildly as I skidded to a stop in front of the gates. They were slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. 30 seconds, I whispered, grabbing the iron handles and pulling them shut. They clanged together with a sound that echoed far too loudly in the still night. But as I turned to leave, I saw something. Just for a second. In the corner of my eye. A figure standing beyond the gates. Motionless. Watching. I didn't wait to get a better look. The third night began with an uneasy stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I followed the usual routine. Check the gates, patrol the paths, and keep my lantern burning. But no matter how much I tried to focus, the whispers were louder tonight. Not faint or distant anymore. They were clear, sharp, and coming from every direction. At first I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to my imagination. But then I started hearing words. My name. "Ethan," a voice murmured. Soft and deliberate. I spun around, the lantern's light cutting through the shadows. No one was there. My heart thudded painfully as I took a shaky step forward. "Who's there?" My voice was unsteady, but the silence that followed was worse. The wind picked up suddenly, cold and biting, carrying a sound I couldn't mistake. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. When I turned, I saw it. A shadow, tall and distorted, standing near the old oak tree. The lantern's flame flickered violently, casting the figure in and out of existence. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow wasn't just standing. It was moving, slithering toward me in jerky, unnatural motions. The rules. Follow the rules. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a crooked headstone. My mind raced through the list, searching for anything that might save me. Then I remembered. Stay on the paths after midnight. Never step into the grass. The shadow stopped just at the edge of the path. It hovered there, as if testing the invisible boundary. My lungs burned from holding my breath. It didn't cross. I didn't dare move, afraid to draw its attention, but it didn't seem to care about me anymore. Instead, it melted into the ground like smoke, disappearing into the tall grass. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. Then the lantern flickered again, dimming almost to darkness, and that's when I saw it. The freshly disturbed grave. The one I had carefully avoided the night before was now open. The gaping hole in the earth felt like it was staring at me. The air around it was colder, sharper, and something wet glistened at the bottom. I wanted to leave, to run back to the cabin and lock the door, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. A sound came from the grave. A low, wet, gurgling noise that didn't belong in the world of the living. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to step closer. The voice rose from the grave, warped and guttural. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no!" The soil around the grave shifted, caving in slightly, and something began to rise. A hand. It wasn't a normal hand. The skin was pale and stretched too tight, the fingers long and sharp like claws. It clawed at the edge of the grave, pulling up a figure that was all wrong. Its limbs too long, its face an empty, hollow void. It reached for the path, its claws scraping against the dirt. And then it stopped. I realized why. The rules. It couldn't touch the path. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The creature didn't need to reach the path. It began to pull something from the grave instead. A shape, limp and pale, wrapped in dirty fabric. My breath hitched as I realized what it was. A body. It was precious. And then it turned back to the grave, disappearing into the darkness below. The soil closed over them, sealing itself as if nothing had happened. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I locked the door and collapsed into the chair by the desk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the lantern, but they didn't explain why any of this was happening. I pulled out the journal I'd found earlier and flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. One entry caught my eye. The graves are hungrier during the blood moon. If they call your name, don't answer. If they knock, don't open. They only need one mistake. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the window, where the moon hung low and red in the sky. That's when the knocking started. The sound was soft at first, almost polite, like someone tapping to get my attention. It came from the cabin door, steady and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I clutched the lantern, my pulse racing. Rule 7, never answer the door after midnight. No one should be there. I stayed frozen in the chair, hoping the knocking would stop. But it didn't. It grew louder, more insistent, until the entire cabin seemed to shake with the force of it. The voice from the grave. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood, trying to keep silent. My hands were white-knuckled around the lantern's handle. Then the knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard it, the creak of the floorboards inside the cabin. Something was already here. The creaking sound grew louder, each step deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was in the cabin wanted me to hear them coming. I held my breath, gripping the lantern like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. The dim light flickered, casting warped shadows on the walls. "Eden," the voice echoed again, impossibly close. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside, and it knew my name. I turned slowly toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. The shadows there seemed alive, writhing and twisting as if they were trying to escape the walls. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath turning into visible puffs in the icy air. My hands shook as I remembered the journal's warning. If they knock, don't open. They only need one mistake. But I hadn't opened the door. A faint scraping sound came from the bedroom, a soft, rhythmic noise, like nails dragging across wood. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and took a shaky step toward the hallway. The lantern barely illuminated the narrow corridor, the shadows pressing in from all sides. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was trying to hold me back. The bedroom door was ajar, swaying slightly as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. Ethek. The voice came again, low and guttural, vibrating in my chest. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't leave. If whatever was inside had broken the rules, the entire graveyard could be at risk. I reached the door, my fingers trembling as I pushed it open. The room was empty. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was untouched, the window shut tight. But then I saw it. The figure standing in the corner, its back to me. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. The figure swayed slightly, as if it were breathing, though there was no sound. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against my chest like a weight. Then it turned. Its face, or what was supposed to be a face, was a hollow void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull the light from the room. Where eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty pits. Its mouth was a jagged tear, stretching impossibly wide as it let out a guttural hiss. The lantern flickered violently, and I stumbled back, my heel catching on the rug. I hit the ground hard, the lantern tumbling from my grip. The light sputtered, casting frantic, disjointed shadows as the figure began to move toward me. I scrambled backward, my hand brushing against something cold and metallic, the shovel. My fingers closed around the handle, and I swung it wildly as the figure lunged. The blade sliced through the air, hitting nothing but darkness, but the force of it sent me tumbling into the hallway. The figure followed, its movements jerky and unnatural, its long limbs scraping against the walls as it crawled toward me. I pushed myself to my feet, clutching the shovel like a lifeline. My mind raced, trying to remember the rules. There had to be something I could do to stop this thing. Then I remembered the salt. Rule 4. Salt lines are your protection. Never leave them incomplete. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. The salt lines. I hadn't checked them tonight. The creature was closer now, its hollow face mere inches from mine. I swung the shovel again, the blade connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature recoiled, giving me just enough time to run. "No," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. The creature was behind me, its presence a suffocating weight pressing down on my shoulders. I dropped to my knees, frantically reaching for the salt container on the nearby table. My hands trembled as I poured it onto the floor, the white granules spilling unevenly. The creature let out a deafening screech, the sound piercing and otherworldly. I turned just in time to see it lunge, its clawed hand reaching for my throat. With a desperate cry, I threw the salt at it. The granules hit its skin, or what passed for skin, and it recoiled with a violent hiss. Smoke rose where the salt touched, the creature writhing and twisting as if in agony. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed the lantern and the remaining salt and ran outside, slamming the door behind me. It was eerily quiet. The only sound, my ragged breathing. The air felt different, heavier, darker, like the ground itself was alive. I made my way to the oldest part of the cemetery, where the graves were overgrown and crumbling. The journal had mentioned something about this place, but I hadn't understood it at the time. Now, I had no choice but to follow its cryptic warnings. The creature was still behind me, its guttural growls growing louder. I turned and threw a line of salt between us, the granules forming a shimmering barrier. For a moment, the creature hesitated, its empty gaze locked on me. Then it spoke, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "You broke the rules, Ethan. Now you belong to us." The ground beneath me trembled, and I stumbled, the lantern slipping from my grasp. The light went out, plunging me into darkness. And then the earth opened up. The ground beneath me opened like a gaping maw, and I fell, plunging into a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the air around me. I screamed, but the sound was lost, absorbed into the void like it had never existed. When I finally stopped falling, I was on solid ground again, or at least it felt like ground. The air here was damp and thick, carrying a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. I groped for the lantern, but it was gone. Instead, a faint red glow illuminated the area, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Dozens of figures surrounded me, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They stood motionless, their faces obscured by shadows. My heart raced as I recognized the uniform of a graveyard keeper on a few of them, tattered and stained with what looked like centuries of decay. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. One of them stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. As they came closer, I saw their face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale and stretched thin, their eyes hollow pits that seemed to pull the light into them. "We are the keepers," they said, their voice a low rasp that sent chills down my spine. "The ones who came before you." My breath caught in my throat. The journal's warnings suddenly made sense. It wasn't a guide for survival. It was a record of failure. "You broke the rules," the figure continued, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. "And now, you are one of us." I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief. No, this can't be happening. I fixed the salt line. I followed the rules." "Not all of them," they interrupted. "You left the grave of the Whispering Widow unmarked. The moment her voice reached your ears, your fate was sealed." Memory hit me like a punch to the gut. The faint humming I'd dismissed earlier, the sound I thought was the wind, it had been her. I turned, desperate to find a way out. The red glow pulsed brighter now, illuminating the cavern around me. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone and glowing faintly. They felt alive, twisting and writhing like they were watching me. In the center of the cavern stood an ancient, weathered tombstone. The name on it was illegible, but the air around it crackled with energy. The figures began to close in, their voices overlapping in a haunting chorus. "You are bound to this place, Ethan, forever." "No!" I screamed, backing toward the tombstone. "There has to be a way out." "There is no escape," they intoned. "We tried. We all tried." My mind raced, searching for anything I could do, the rules. There had to be a loophole, something they missed, but as I thought back to the journal, I realized the truth. The rules weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to keep the cemetery contained. The tombstone pulsed brighter, and I felt a force pulling me toward it. I clawed at the ground, trying to resist, but it was useless. The whispers grew louder, filling my head until I thought my skull would split. And then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the cabin. The lantern was on the table, its warm glow casting familiar shadows across the room. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined everything. Then I saw the journal. It was open to a page I didn't recognize, the handwriting jagged and frantic. "Do not trust the silence. It is always watching." I turned toward the window. Outside, the graveyard stretched endlessly, shrouded in mist. And in the distance, near the oldest graves, I saw them, the keepers, standing motionless, their hollow eyes fixed on the cabin. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and my blood ran cold. My face was pale, my eyes empty pits of darkness. As I passed by, my mother started crying out for me to stop. Clara locked eyes with me in silence. I was one of them now. The cabin door creaked open behind me, and I felt a chill sweep through the room. A new journal appeared on the table, its pages blank. A voice whispered in my ear, low and cold. Nah, write the rules. Someone new will come soon. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling as I began to write. Rule 1. Never listen to the whispers.